Apologies have been received from Senator Ned O'Sullivan. Given that an Tánaiste is ready, I think we should proceed with public business first and dispose of private business when the engagement with the Tánaiste is concluded. In today's meeting, we meet with an Tánaiste Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Deputy Seán Crowe, to discuss the general scheme of the miscellaneous provisions withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union on 29 March 2013, Bill 2019. You are very welcome here today, and I also welcome your officials and thank them for the briefing supplied in advance of the meeting. I'd also like to thank colleagues in the Joint Committee on European Union Affairs for accommodating this approach to this particular meeting. The format of the meeting is that we will hear the opening statement from an Tánaiste before going into a question and answer session with the members of the committee. Before we begin, may I remind members, witnesses and those in the public gallery to ensure that their mobile phones are switched off completely for the duration of the meeting, as to cause interference even on silent mode with the recording equipment in the committee room. Also, I remind members of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person or body outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I now call on the Tánaiste to make your opening statement. On Tánaiste.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to come before the committee, particularly in advance of next week when we'll publish the legislation that hopefully I can give you some information on now. First of all, as I said, I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation to be here today to discuss the miscellaneous provisions withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union on the 29th of March 2019, Bill 2019. I'd also like to thank you for facilitating me by hosting this session today. I appreciate the attendance of members of both the Committee for Foreign Affairs and the European Affairs Committee to this session. I very much appreciate your time and engagement as we bring forward this omnibus bill to address a range of critical issues that may arise in the context of a no-deal Brexit. While there are 6 weeks to go until Brexit formally happens on the 29th of March, the political process is, of course, continuing. However, as they have done since the decision to leave the EU was first taken, the answers lie with Westminster. The EU remains committed to achieving an ambitious and comprehensive future partnership with the UK. Should the UK's intentions for the future partnership evolve, the EU will adjust the level of ambition of the political declaration on the future relationship. But the EU has made it absolutely clear that it stands by the withdrawal agreement and it's not open for renegotiation. President Tusk and President Juncker reaffirmed this during the Taoiseach's visit to Brussels last week, and they reaffirmed the EU's continued solidarity on the backstop. The Taoiseach also met with Prime Minister May at her request in Dublin last Friday. Throughout, our focus has been on securing the withdrawal agreement, which is the best and only way to ensure an orderly and managed withdrawal. While we've been working to secure agreement, preparations for Brexit and the changes it will bring have been underway since the beginning. More recently, with the impending approach of the Brexit deadline and the uncertainty in London, we have no choice but to ramp up our no-deal preparations. This bill is one of the most tangible expressions of the deep and broad preparation that's underway across multiple government departments. Our work at national level is complementary to the significant work underway across the EU to be as prepared as we can possibly be just in case the UK leaves the EU without a deal on the 29th of March. While certain areas of our contingency planning require legislation, many do not. A wide range of other measures are underway, such as the recruitment of customs and SPS officials, preparations at ports and airports, and a range of financial and advisory supports for businesses to help them prepare and plan for Brexit. This omnibus bill covers the issues in primary legislation that need to be addressed immediately in the event of a no-deal Brexit. It also contains an amendment to the Interpretation Act, which would be needed should the withdrawal agreement be ratified in order to facilitate a transition period. Measures relevant in the case of a no-deal Brexit were identified following a detailed screening by all government departments of legislation currently in force. The government published the general scheme of the Omnibus Bill on the 24th of January. The bill contains 16 parts, addressing primary legislative issues which would require immediate attention in a no-deal scenario. This is a very wide-ranging bill, but given the emergency nature of this legislation, the government took the decision that progressing this through the Houses as an omnibus bill is the most sensible way to ensure that we have the necessary legislation enacted on time before the 29th of March. This bill focuses on protecting our citizens and supporting the economy, enterprise and jobs, particularly in key economic sectors that are vulnerable. It will underpin the common travel area and help to ensure that the associated rights and entitlements of Irish and British citizens under this long-standing arrangement will continue in any circumstances. In the area of health, the bill will provide for a range of existing reciprocal healthcare arrangements between Ireland and the UK to be maintained after the UK leaves the EU. The Minister for Health will be provided with the power to make regulations in a number of matters, including to enable persons from Ireland to access healthcare in the UK. So in a practical sense, what we're trying to protect here is the ability of young children to come from Belfast to Dublin for specialist paediatric care, the many patients in Donegal that go across the border to Derry, to Auchnagalvin Hospital, where Irish taxpayers' money has helped to put some of the infrastructure in place, and so on. We have, particularly over the last 20 years, found a way to cooperate in a pragmatic and friendly way to make the best of the infrastructure on both sides of the border from a healthcare perspective. And we want to continue to do that, even when Northern Ireland, as part of the United Kingdom, is outside of the European Union. The bill will also provide for the continued payment of 21 social protection benefits, including payments such as old age pensions, illness benefit and child benefit, in any circumstances. It also provides protection for workers whose UK-based employer might become insolvent. At the moment, all of these issues are essentially protected under EU regulations or derogations or directives. But many of us will know British citizens living in Ireland with pensions coming from the UK every week or every month. And certainly many of us will know many Irish citizens in the UK, living in the UK now, that continue to get their pensions from here. Likewise, parents getting child benefit and so on across border or between Britain and Ireland. It doesn't naturally follow that those payments remain intact in a no-deal Brexit scenario unless we plan for that. And what we're doing is two things. First of all, we are signing an agreement between Ireland and the UK to protect social protection payments, but we're also putting primary legislation in place here to make sure that that we can make that seamless transition if we face this cliff edge at the end of March, where Britain essentially crashes out of the European Union without a managed exit and all of the arrangements that should be in place for that. Furthermore, the bill will allow for SUSI grants to be paid to eligible Irish students studying in the UK, as well as of course, UK students in Irish higher education institutions. So, as you know, at the moment, and I'm a beneficiary of this. I went to university in the UK. The British taxpayer paid for some of my education, and there are many British students in Irish third-level institutions, and they are more than welcome here. And we don't want to turn this into a situation where Irish students in the UK and UK students in Ireland are paying foreign student fees. And we certainly don't want to have a situation where we cannot support in the way we do today through student grants young Irish students going to British colleges or universities in the future. So again, practical legislation in the education area to be able to protect that arrangement in the context of a no-deal Brexit, should it happen, which I believe to be unlikely, but we have to plan for. Provisions in transport will ensure that cross-border bus and rail services will continue to operate, ensuring continued service provision for passengers and commuters on the island of Ireland. So you would assume that if you get on a train in Dublin and go to Belfast, that is a pretty straightforward process. Well, post-Brexit, that train will be leaving the European Union and travelling into a third country and coming back in again. These are things we don't think about, but they need a legal base in terms of recognition of drivers and a whole range of other things around safety provision and so on, and safety certification, and likewise in relation to bus journeys. So a lot of the things that nobody thought about when they voted either for or against Brexit, we need to think about and we need to plan for, and in this case we need to legislate for. Enterprise Ireland will be given additional enabling power to further support businesses through investment, loans and research and development and investment grants will also be enhanced with this legislation, or the capacity to give them will be enhanced for Irish businesses to ensure that they can remain competitive and resilient in the context of a no-deal Brexit. This is one of the only areas actually where we were likely to bring forward this legislation anyway, because Enterprise Ireland had been looking for this increased power, but it makes sense to take this element out of a bigger bill that was planned for some stage in the next 12 months and to put it into this legislation so that we maximise the capacity for Enterprise Ireland to be able to support businesses, particularly in vulnerable sectors, through what will be a very difficult transition for many of them if a no-deal Brexit were to materialise. Since the publication of the general scheme of the Omnibus Bill, intensive work has been underway between government departments and the Attorney-General's Office. On the basis of this work, there have been some updates and amendments to the draft bill. These include new provisions which will introduce postponed accounting for VAT purposes in a no-deal scenario. This will mitigate against a potential cash flow burden faced by businesses post-Brexit. This issue is highlighted by the industry, and this is a practical measure which will support businesses. So, in simple terms, what we're doing here is helping businesses with cash flow. In the future, unfortunately, because of new trading relationships on the back of a no-deal Brexit, businesses that are importing product from the UK back and forth on a weekly or daily basis, unless we legislate to facilitate better arrangements, they'll have to pay VAT on each consignment. At the moment, businesses pay VAT every second month. And so what essentially we're saying is, in that kind of trading environment, we're legislating to ensure that businesses will be able to continue to essentially calculate their VAT and actually pay from a cash flow perspective once every second month, rather than on the delivery of every individual consignment that may well have to go through customs checks and SPS checks and so on, particularly in relation to east-west trade, whether that's coming through Dublin Port, Dublin Airport or Rosslare. Following consultation with the Attorney-General's Office, the original Part 16 of the draft bill, which contained amendments to the Data Protection Act, will now be covered by statutory instrument. Similarly, certain health provisions, which were in the original draft bill, will now be provided for through secondary legislation, which is good news because it simplifies the arrangements. While this bill covers a range of areas, it's very much operational legislation to allow for many of our current arrangements with the UK to continue to function after they leave the European Union and become a third country outside the Union. Government has discussed this proposed legislation through our meetings in January and February. Its provisions are the subject of daily engagements between departments and the Parliamentary Council now. We expect to publish the full Omnibus Bill on the 22nd of February, that's Friday week, tomorrow week, and we will continue to work closely with the Business Committee to confirm timelines, I should say, and deadlines. So just to be clear, what we're proposing to do next week is that we would bring this legislation to Cabinet on Tuesday, have the government sign off on it, and then what happens, particularly with a complicated piece of legislation, is that it goes back to government departments for a sort of a final check to make sure that it's right, and then it gets published. So we'll publish it on time, as we said we would, tomorrow week, on Friday. But I will happily brief opposition parties before Friday of next week, before we publish it, to make sure there's no surprises and everybody understands what's coming, because we have to work together in relation to this legislation. And then, once it's published, the plan is that it would go before the Dáil for second stage from the 26th to the 28th of February, which essentially is the week after next. It'll go through Dáil committee and report stage then from the 4th to the 7th, sorry, the 4th to the 8th of March. And the way we want to do this is we want to do it through a committee of the House. So the original thought process was that we would try to maybe do it through this committee or this combined committees. But I think, having spoken to all the political parties, there seems to be a view that this legislation is important enough to actually bring it through a committee of the House, which means no one gets excluded, no one is required to be a committee member or anything like that. Anybody in the House can come and speak and ask questions and get clarification. And it'll also allow us to bring in government ministers to take the sections of the legislation that apply to their government departments. So there's 9 different government departments, if you include the Taoiseach's department, that have sections of this legislation. And so, you know, for education, we'll bring in Minister McHugh to be able to deal with his section, answer questions and deal with any amendments or whatever. And likewise, you know, Regina Doherty for her area, Charlie Flanagan for his area, and so on. It'll then go to the Seanad, if all goes well, for second stage on the 11th and 12th of March, followed then by committee and report stage in the Seanad on the 13th and 14th of March. So in just the build-up to St. Patrick's Day, a lot of ministers will be away, but I won't be. I'll be away for part of that week, but I'll be around for this legislation. So I'll be sticking around European capitals for obvious reasons. So that's the timeline that we're hoping you can work with us on. And you'll find me absolutely open in relation to briefings, reassurance, clarifications. If you want to test ideas or amendments, we can do it either offline or online, whatever you want. But you know, this is an emergency situation for the country. This is emergency legislation. We need to get it done together to protect Irish people, whether they be pensioners or students or the travelling public. I think we can get it done in this timeline. And I have to say, so far, the engagement with other political parties has been really positive. So there's absolutely nothing party political here in what we're doing. And as I said, we'll work in a very constructive way with everyone on this process. This legislation is an essential part of our whole of government preparations for Brexit. Our contingency action plan was published on the 19th of December, and an update to this was published on the 30th of January. We'll continue to provide such updates right into March. I appreciate the cooperation from all members of the House for their assistance and cooperation to ensure that we can get this bill through the relevant stages and enact the legislation, of course, before the 29th of March, should it be needed. I hope it won't be, by the way. I also think it won't be, but we can't be sure. We would be very foolish to take anything for granted, given the unpredictable nature of Brexit negotiations to date. The potential impact of a no-deal Brexit on Ireland would be severe. Minister Donoghue recently outlined the potential macroeconomic impacts, and there would be negative impacts across a number of vulnerable sectors. Our preparations, including through our legislative proposals, are focused on minimising these impacts and protecting as many people and sectors as we can. Ireland will remain an active and enthusiastic member of the EU. The Government is committed to working with the European Commission and with our European partners to minimise any disruption for our citizens and businesses as much as possible, and to forge a positive, continuing positive relationship amongst the EU 27. Of course, we want to keep a positive relationship with the UK too. That's also hugely important to me and to us as a country. but make no mistake, while the UK moves in a different direction away from the European Union, we will not be following. We will be staying as a committed and enthusiastic member of the European Union and its single market and customs union. Chairman and members of the committee, thanks for allowing me to outline some aspects of our legislative planning, and I'm obviously happy to take any questions or comments that you might have.
Thank you very much, Tánaiste. In view of the number of members offering, I'll group questions, so I take Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan and then Deputy Niall Collins. Deputy O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much. And I think, first of all, to acknowledge all the work that has been done and the way in which you and your officials have held on to your sanity in the middle of what has been a pretty insane time for the past few months. I was struck by the journalist, I think, who was interviewing Minister McEntee and was suggesting that Ireland would leave the EU and join with the UK. And I think that was just another example of the lack of knowledge and appreciation of Irish history. Can I just ask the question, on what basis do you think that this legislation won't be necessary? That's one question. And the second one is, you've outlined, and the EU have been strong in terms of Irish interests, but, people are talking about holding your nerve and who's going to blink first. So are you over 100% confident that the EU won't blink first, especially if it came to some matters of trade? And just thirdly, an article in The Guardian, it was just, I suppose, just that particular journalist's view, but I think he was making the point that Prime Minister May wants to deliver the least worst Brexit for her country, and she wants to bring it in as part of the Tory government and determined to avoid a no deal, but she's not going to be able to do that with just the support that she has to date and the DUP, so it's going to require opposition support, and how confident would you be of that? Thanks, Chair.
Deputy Sullivan. Deputy Collins.
Can I ask a couple of questions, or is it just one at a time?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have about 5 in total, so maybe I'll just put them all to the Minister and he can come back to them. Just thanks, Minister, for your Tánaiste, for your opening statement. And just to say that I and my party will do everything that we can to help scrutinise and progress the legislation if necessary. We have only 14 sitting days between now and the 29th of March as of today, so it just shows you that time is tight. We are a little bit concerned that this legislation, we're still awaiting publication of the detail of it, and that we're running it down to the wire. If you look across Europe, the Netherlands published in November, France triggered their contingency plan on the 17th of January, Spain approved theirs on the 11th of January, Italy announced legislation on the 21st of December. In Germany, it's before their parliament. Similar, its draft legislation has been published in Poland, and the Czech Republic, they have it before their parliament also. So we seem to be a little bit behind the curve. So I think, if necessary, we might have to sit extra days and nights between now and the 29th of March, if necessary. Could I ask you? There's just a few, I suppose, specifics that I want to flag to you. You may not be able to answer them here and now, but just to make you aware of them. You'll be aware of the recent AIB Brexit sentiment survey, which revealed that in Q4 of 2018, only 8% of SMEs surveyed had a formal Brexit plan in place. And whilst you'll tell me that you've been engaging with industry and SMEs across the country on an ongoing basis, that number is really, really worryingly low, at only 8%. And it's also backed up by the figures in the various funds which were put in place. The 300 million which was set aside for the Brexit loan scheme has only a 5%. I think only 5% of that has been sanctioned to date. And of the 25 million allocated to the Brexit loan scheme for farmers and fishermen, which was announced in October, that's still not open, as I understand. So I'd appreciate if you could give us an update, I suppose an overview in relation to the contingency planning at that level, because some of those figures which are being quoted, particularly in the AIB sentiment survey, is quite depressing. You mentioned in relation to education and SUSI grants, just to ask you, whilst the clarity will be welcome and that the arrangements will continue, will that just be for the duration in terms of SUSI grants? Will that just be for the duration of the courses
that existing students are on? Or will that continue into the foreseeable future? And do we have any clarity on the fees that Irish students will be subjected to if they choose to study in the UK, particularly from the academic year 2021 onwards? Could I ask you also, I have just two other matters I want to raise with you. It's in relation to the medtech sector, and you'll be familiar with many of them, I'm sure, that some of them are based in Cork, and we have them based in the Midwest and Galway in particular. Estimates from the EU in relation to the medtech sector will tell us that anywhere between 30 to 40% of the medical devices which are in use and in demand are approved through UK designated notifying bodies. Now, I'm told by the medtech sector that the UK-based notifying bodies will no longer be recognised by the EU after the 29th of March, and that devices certified will no longer be in conformity with the EU directive. So we're obviously running into a significant problem there. Are you aware of that? Is that being worked on in particular, because it'll impact so sharply if we have the calamitous event which we're all trying to avoid on the 29th of March? And finally, could I ask you, there was a report in Reuters today, who are a pretty reputable news agency. They're quoting sources in Brussels in relation to a hard Brexit, that the Irish government might get a transition period or some temporary opt-outs to avoid putting up a hard Irish border, and that the government, being the Irish government, will soon have to come up with a plan to protect the EU single market or face checks on their own goods coming in to the rest of the bloc. So I suppose the question flowing from this report in Reuters, I don't know if you've seen it or been made aware of it, given the possibility of a no-deal Brexit because of the opposition to the backstop, are the government looking at, are they being asked to come up with an alternative to the backstop? In the back channels, is the Irish government being asked to come up with an alternative to the backstop, or has the government had any discussions on an alternative border plan? Thanks.
Thanks, Deputy Collins. Tánaiste?
Yeah, lots of questions there. First of all, why do I think this won't be needed? Well, I think we'll need to get it ready to be enacted, but I think there's a strong majority in Westminster that don't want a no-deal Brexit and will act to avoid it. But I can't say that for sure. But I think the reality is that any sane individual that looks at the consequences of a no-deal Brexit for Britain, for Ireland and for many other EU countries, but in particular for Britain and Ireland, who would be the two countries that would be damaged the most, I don't believe that will happen. But it could. But I believe that we will find a way of preventing that, and I hope that the British Parliament can find a way of doing that, because essentially the problem is there, not here. And we had a deal. The British government signed up to it. It took 2 years to negotiate. It was a compromise on all sides, taking into account all perspectives. The British Prime Minister defended it. In my view, still believes in it. But because of the political pressures and realities in Westminster, she's been forced, to move in different directions. I think we should say very firmly that the responsibility to come up with ways of solving the current impasse lies where the impasse is, which is London, not Brussels, not Dublin, not Belfast or anywhere else. But I believe that a way can be found. But I think the only thing the Irish government can do is to continue to be respectful, but firm and fair. And I don't think it's reasonable to ask Ireland to essentially undermine core commitments that were made to Ireland, north and south, in terms of protecting a peace process, providing guarantees around the absence of border infrastructure. And those guarantees weren't time limited. or with exit clauses. They were guarantees that the British government, that the British Prime Minister repeated, by the way, even last week when she gave what I would regard as quite a generous speech in Northern Ireland. So the problem here is politics. You know, there is a fair deal on the table, but there are some who want more and who seem to want to change the current deal, to take out compromises that the UK has been asked to make, but to insist that the EU leaves all the compromises that they were willing to make. You can't negotiate on that basis. And I don't believe the EU will negotiate on that basis. And that's why I don't believe the withdrawal agreement will be reopened. Of course the EU will act and try and put a package together that can give reassurance and clarification to the British Parliament, and we all need to work to try to do that. And of course there's a lot of scope in the political declaration, which is open, of course, to rediscussion and change, because that's a political ambition for the future. It's not a legal divorce agreement, if you like, which is what the withdrawal agreement is. I mean, look, I'm not comfortable with this language of, you know, a game of chicken or who'll blink first. You know, we're all neighbours and friends here. Like, one of the things that's so uncomfortable about this negotiation is, you know, the pressures that have come on the Parliament in Westminster, and indeed the government and the Parliament here and in other parts of Europe, in terms of the lobbying and undermining of people's positions and so on. You know, Britain is a very close friend of Ireland, close neighbours with a very complicated and very tragic history. And we have to find a way through this and out the other side that doesn't damage that relationship and provoke tensions that many people thought we'd left behind. And I would ask people to think about that when they start talking about playing games of chicken. On both sides, by the way. I mean, you know, one of the big mistakes, in my view, in London is this perspective that, you know, the EU needs a deal as much as we need a deal. Like, it's just factually not true, first and foremost. But we do want a deal. When I say we, I'm talking about the EU. And we want to be reasonable and fair about that. We want a future relationship with Britain which is positive, where there aren't winners and losers in these negotiations, but we find a compromise to move this process forward in a way that respects that relationship. Opposition support, yeah, I mean, I've been critical of the party in government, but also the main party of opposition in Westminster. When you compare it to what's happening in our Parliament, we working with the main opposition party, working with Sinn Féin too, parties that are in intense competition with each other at election time, don't agree with each other in lots of areas in terms of political approaches and perspectives and so on. But by and large, in relation to this issue, people are willing to work together and trying to find a way forward. And I think it's regrettable that that kind of approach hasn't been possible. Even now, with what is it, 43 days to go? And we still don't have a proper formal dialogue between the two main parties in the British Parliament. And I say that as somebody who spent a lot of my life in England, who is a product of the Anglo-Irish relationship. A lot of my family have British passports on my mother's side. I was in university there, I worked in Scotland. Britain is a great country, but we got to call it as it is. And it is incredible, in my view, that the British Parliament has allowed it come to this. But that being said, I still believe that there is a way to get through this process and to have a managed, controlled and predictable Brexit, and we have the basis for the deal. It's there, if people would just take it rather than try and look for more all the time. And if people, instead of trying to compromise with hardliners on both sides, if middle ground, sensible thinking took control of this process, I think we'd find a solution a lot quicker. In terms of Niall's questions on 14 sitting days left. I mean, look, I think we can get this done. The reason why the Netherlands, France, Spain and others have either legislation in train or have passed legislation is that they've done it very differently to us. Their legislation is much more straightforward. They're essentially they're giving the powers to government to act by decree in some cases. So in other words, they're just giving emergency powers to a minister or ministers in certain sectors. We're not really doing that. We are actually passing more detailed legislation which provides for the protection of a CTA, primarily, the Common Travel Area between Britain and Ireland, where essentially British and Irish citizens are sort of almost recognised as citizens in each other's countries. And so in multiple areas, we have much more comprehensive legislation than most other countries that would have passed sort of short, punchy emergency legislation. And because our legislation is a much bigger piece of legislation, the idea that we would have passed this weeks or months ago without knowing that we really needed to, I think would have taken up an awful lot of parliamentary time and would have been unnecessary. But I think we need to do it now. In relation to the Brexit sentiment survey, I mean, look, there are lots of surveys that have taken place. The one thing we know for sure, if you speak to Irish agencies, whether it's through local enterprise offices, through Enterprise Ireland, through the IDA, or through the Department of Jobs, there has been a dramatic increase in the awareness of Brexit issues over the last 6 to 12 months. And anybody who tells me that businesses aren't talking about Brexit right now, I'm sorry, I just don't believe them. It may be the case that not a high enough percentage have a formal Brexit plan. That's true. But many businesses simply don't know what kind of plan they need to put in place because they don't know what Brexit's going to look like. That's also the truth. So just because a business doesn't have a formal Brexit plan does not mean that they haven't put contingency in place for different scenarios. In relation to the Brexit loan scheme, I don't think we ever expected that there was going to be a huge take-up in the Brexit loan scheme until Brexit actually crystallises. So, like, if you're a company that knows that if Brexit goes the wrong way, you're going to have to invest significantly in increased storage, for example, because you can't rely on the just-in-time economic model that goes with a single market and single customs union, but if you're going to have to spend hundreds of thousands or millions of euros doing that, you're not going to trigger that decision until you actually know you need to. I think that those Brexit loan schemes are important. Actually, there has been quite significant take-up on the previous Brexit schemes for farmers. But the current 300 million loan scheme, I think people are holding back until they get more clarity in terms of what they need to actually do. The SUSI grants, the legislation is dealing with 2019 initially, but the intention here is that this would be renewed year after year. But the key thing is that we'll have the base legislation there to facilitate that. But there's absolutely no indication at all that, certainly this government anyway, has no intention of removing the supports that are there for young Irish students going to college in the UK. In terms of the medtech sector, it's a huge issue. The truth is that medicines and a lot of medical devices get authorised and approved for the EU market in the UK. Many of them do. That authorisation now is not likely to be available in the UK any longer. And so, businesses will have to essentially reshape their supply chains, where they get authorisation, where they take product and finish product in order to get authorisation. And indeed, in terms of the supply of medicines, that needs to be taken into account as well in terms of where we source and how we source medicines in the future. Because the European Medicines Agency, for example, would have signed off on all of the medicines that would have been produced and approved in the UK, and there is significant That's a significant industry there. And of course, that certification may no longer be available in the UK, and therefore those supply chains will need to change as well. But there's been a huge amount of contingency planning done in the medicines sector and in the medtech sector and in the pharma sector generally. I mean, if you speak to, I was at a Brexit meeting last night, and 2 pharma companies were there, and I spoke to them afterwards, and they've essentially been planning for 2 years for this, and they would have signed off on assuming the worst probably about 6 months ago. So a lot of that money has already been spent, actually, in terms of reshaping their supply chains and so on, because they simply can't wait for political decisions because of the time it takes to implement new plans. So that's already a significant opportunity lost, even if Brexit becomes a more controlled and managed process than it's threatening to be. Finally then, look, I'd be wary of Brussels sources, quite frankly. You know, I hear rumours coming out of Brussels, just like I hear rumours coming out of London every day on Brexit. So, you know, unless there is a name behind a source and a quote, then I'm pretty suspicious of it, because there's a lot of spin and a lot of manoeuvring and a lot of politics around this issue. So, you know, we continue to talk all the time to the European Commission in terms of contingency planning, where the EU has to make decisions collectively, and where Ireland has a responsibility to make decisions as well. But it is understood in the European Commission the sensitivity of the border issue in Ireland. And as far as I'm concerned, the British government has made a commitment to Ireland to not make decisions that would result in physical border infrastructure re-emerging between the 2 jurisdictions on this island. And they have an obligation to follow through on that commitment. We are both, as countries, co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, both in terms of text and in terms of spirit. And that was the whole reason why the backstop emerged as the compromise solution here. And deal or no deal, there's an obligation on both the Irish and British governments and the EU to try to work together to find a way of avoiding physical border infrastructure on this island. And we've been very clear and firm on that, and will continue to be.
Thanks, Taoiseach, for your reply. Can you just confirm, I suppose, just give us a bit of clarity or certainty that you're not coming under any pressure to find an alternative to the backstop? Is that what you're saying? You're clear? Well,
I mean, the UK are the ones that are talking about alternative arrangements to the backstop, not us.
The EU. Is the Irish government coming under any pressure from anywhere within the EU to find an alternative to the backstop?
No, I don't think so. The pressure isn't on Ireland. I think the pressure is on London.
Okay. Thanks, Taoiseach. Deputy Cullinan and then Senator Richmond.
And first of all, I just want to thank the Minister for giving us an outline of what will be in the bill, and I've read the general scheme of the provisions of the bill, Minister, so I'm somewhat acquainted to what the bill will hope to achieve. So just first of all to say that obviously whatever we can do to support the passage of the bill, we will. I would concur with Niall Collins that it would have been better had this been published earlier. You're talking about this going to Cabinet next Tuesday, published the following week, and then it comes to the Dáil at the end of the month, which means we're, 3-4 weeks before D-Day. So I think it would have been better had we had more time. You would appreciate it is a comprehensive bill. It will cover 9 departments, and obviously there would be spokespeople for those respective portfolios that will want to have an input into that as well, and I'll get to that in a minute in terms of process. But notwithstanding that, obviously, whatever support we can give, we will, to make sure that this is done, because we need to plan for every eventuality. I just want to make one point on the general politics, if I can, because I think, Minister, you're right to point out that there has been an agreed Irish position and a consistent position both from government and opposition on this issue. As somebody who's been in Westminster a couple of times over the last number of months and met political parties over there, politicians, but also I've done a lot of media, the commentariat are struck in Britain at the level of unity that exists in Ireland in comparison to the disunity that exists in Westminster. So it is quite striking to them, and I think it's been to our benefit that we've had that. And just to point out that it isn't just in the south, in the north as well, obviously with the exception of the DUP, the other parties have been united and have done a lot of collaborative work in relation to supporting the backstop and doing meetings in Brussels and in Westminster as well, and I think that has been for the good. And then on terms of the bigger politics, and to bring that back to the bill, because you're right to say that the solutions to any problems should come from the people who are creating the impasse, and that is the British government, who are reneging on a deal that was already done. And I think you're right, we have to watch our language and temper what we say, because we don't want to end up by accident or by design in a situation where we have a hard crash. But if we arrive at a hard crash, it won't be the fault of any politicians in Ireland, that's for sure. So if we arrive at a situation where there is a hard crash, and however unlikely people might think that will be, it's still a possibility, there will have to be then tough decisions made, and there will have to be actions taken by the Irish government in relation to the border. So all the other provisions in here are all very necessary, all important, but what happens at the border in the event of a hard crash is the elephant in the room. And I have heard you say before why you can't answer that question, but it is a question that's been asked, and in fact there was, as you know, a very important event that took place in Belfast in the waterfront, 1,700 people from across civic nationalism, and there was a very real concern about what would happen in that scenario and the lack of any clarity that was coming from the Irish government on that issue. So that is something that is lacking. It's the biggest contingency that will have to be put in place, and yet it's not at all covered in this bill. Then just to get to the bill itself in terms of the, or when we get to the bill in terms of its provisions.
Sorry, nothing in the bill deals with border infrastructure, north-south or east-west, though.
I understand that.
Yeah, so
I understand, but
yeah.
that's my point. There is, but
it was never to be dealt with in the bill.
Yeah, I accept that, but my point is we don't know what contingencies are in place in the event of a hard crash. All of this, if I'm correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this bill is predicated upon a no-deal scenario. Is that correct? By and large?
Well, apart from the very last section of it,
but you've
which
mentioned earlier, by and
essentially
large,
allows the UK to be considered a member state through a transition period if there is agreement on the withdrawal agreement, but all of the rest of it is for no deal.
Exactly. And in a no-deal scenario, my point, Minister, is that the biggest contingency that we will have to deal with will be what happens at the border. And that's my point. But anyway, I've made that point. In relation to the process, I welcome the fact that you're making yourself available for briefings. I think it might be useful if ministers, in terms of the respective sections of the bill, make themselves available to spokespeople as well. I think that might be necessary. It depends on the depth, I suppose, and we'll wait and see what's in the bill when we get it, although it seems in some areas substantial, which is good. Just in terms of the Minister for Business, Enterprise and Innovation and the provisions in that bill, it talks about support further support for businesses, loans, R&D, all of which is good. That could be argued that's necessary, whether there's a soft or a hard Brexit. That, you know, IBEC and ISME have been calling for these provisions. There's going to be an economic impact, regardless of whether it's a hard crash. And again, why is that only in the event of a hard crash that we would put those additional resources in place? And one thing that's not covered, and I've seen raised that the Transport Committee might be in a position to answer this one, is the insurance green card. And I heard that raised on national media as well, or some concern in relation to that. Why is that not covered in this bill? And is that something that will be covered somewhere else? And how is the government going to deal with that one? And my final observation, Minister, is that will some of this require additional spending? And you might be able to identify where the additional spending, where the money will come from in the first instance if it does require additional spending, and in what areas will this incur a cost and incur additional spending? And given that there needs to be obviously investment made by the Irish state, what's also coming through from the stakeholders as well, and I've met with the British Irish Chambers of Commerce and business groups and trade unions, is that Europe also needs to step up to the plate in relation to funding streams, but also easing state aid rules. So where is that in the context of this bill? Is that something that's been looked at separately with the European Union? And what responses will be required of Europe in the event of a hard crash as well, Minister, if you're able to respond to those questions. So I'll leave it at that. And obviously we'll have a critique and we'll support some elements of the bill, and there'll obviously be amendments. So we'll obviously leave that until second stage, Minister. So we're not going to go into any criticisms or critiques of it other than what I've already said. And I look forward to the bill being published.
Thanks, Deputy Cullinan. Senator Neil Richmond.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and Taoiseach, thank you once again for this comprehensive overview. And I know myself and the Chairman agreed with all our colleagues yesterday at the Working Group Committee Chairs that there was another comprehensive briefing, and I definitely sense the full support from all committee chairs and all parties to get this through in time. And it's Deputy Cullinan is right to remark on the unity in the Irish political process, but I think we can't leave out the clear unity in the European political process. It is a serious achievement to see 27 member states and the most powerful supranational institution in the world maintaining unity in the face of absolute chaos in Westminster. I have two specific questions. The first is, parallel to this bill, the Commission produced their 19 legislative proposals on December 19th. And I was wondering, what's the process in order to allow them to be transposed into Irish law? Has that got underway, or is that done through this bill? And the second thing is, you rightly say it's immensely regrettable that we're even having to look at heads of this bill this week or have briefings and discuss it, and the fact that it's come to this, and that regret, of course, is in no way the fault of the Irish government or any European government, but it does lie with the confusion in Westminster. And I was just wondering, how much time has been taken up preparing this bill and preparing the crash-out measures from an Irish government side? I do believe it's absolutely necessary, given we're less than 50 days away from Brexit, but I fear it's an awful lot of very valuable time from very skilled individuals, particularly in our diplomatic corps, that could be put to better national use. And I really hope we don't have to use it, but I really regret that we have to possibly have wasted so much time of something that's not of our control, unfortunately. That's it from me, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Richmond. On Taoiseach.
Yeah, first of all, to Deputy Cullinan, I mean, just on the timing, just to say that, I mean, we'd set the date of the 22nd of February. I'm trying to remember when, but it would have been early January anyway, from what I can remember. So, you know, I'm comfortable we can do this in time. You know, if you introduce emergency legislation, it needs to be reasonably close to the emergency. You know, I think if we'd been doing this in November, December, it would have taken up a huge amount of parliamentary time, and you know, I think a lot of people might have predicted at that stage that we would have had a lot more clarity by now. So, you know, with the cooperation of others, I think we can get this done. And again, if you compare it to the UK, the amount of legislation that they will have to introduce in a no-deal scenario, or indeed, even if there is a transition period agreed, if the withdrawal agreement was signed off on in the morning, there is a considerable number of weeks' work in the British Parliament to bring in legislation. So, you know, and I think, you know, one of the things I'd like to say is, you know, in relation to some of these bilateral arrangements around common travel area and so on, we've worked very well with the British government in terms of trying to protect some core issues, whether that's the Good Friday Agreement and all of the complexity of that in the context of Brexit, the common travel area stuff, cross-border healthcare, students. You know, without reciprocal arrangements on the British side, we wouldn't be able to solve problems here. So I think it's important to say that. And while there is, you know, a lot of frustration across the EU and in particular in Ireland that the Brexit issues don't have more clarity, in terms of some of this contingency planning, there has been good cooperation. In terms of no-deal planning, look, I mean, if there's a no-deal and Britain crashes out, Ireland, Britain and the EU will have a very difficult job to do to manage the consequences of that in the context of the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Our view on this has always been that if there are no agreed solutions here, well then the default position is regulatory alignment between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland in the areas necessary to prevent physical border infrastructure, for good reason. That was agreed in December 2017, long before the withdrawal agreement was signed off on. That was agreed, that actually we would resolve the border issues through one of three ways, either through a comprehensive future relationship, a future trade deal, or if it wasn't possible in that, the UK would offer bespoke solutions to Ireland to solve this problem, presumably some form of technology or other ideas. But if there was no agreement on that, in terms of its capacity to do the job, then the commitment was very clear in writing that the UK would maintain full alignment with the rules of the customs union and single market in the areas necessary to prevent border infrastructure and to protect the peace agreement. So, as far as I'm concerned, that commitment, which was given at the time in return for the EU and Ireland allowing the process to move on and talk about the future relationship, which hadn't really been discussed at that point, those commitments still stand. And I think, we can't just wipe the slate clean and have people making farcical arguments like, well, we don't want a border, you don't want a border, the EU doesn't want a border, so let's just pretend it's not a problem. That's kindergarten stuff. And to be fair to the Prime Minister, I think she's faced down that kind of thinking. There needs to be a legally sound, practical solution here. If there are alternatives to the backstop, they should be explored and tested. They have been for 2 years. And the best solution that people could come up with in terms of the guarantee or the fallback position or the insurance mechanism was the backstop. And so even in the withdrawal agreement and in the future relationship declaration, there is a mention of alternative arrangements. There's a mention of the fact that the backstop is a temporary arrangement that can be replaced by alternative arrangements, but they've got to do the same job. And I think we need to be honest with people. I've yet to see another approach that can do the same job. Unless, of course, we have such a comprehensive future relationship agreement and trading arrangement that doesn't require border infrastructure. But look, we will continue to try to work in a constructive way on that issue. In terms of will ministers be available for briefing? They will, yeah. So we'll probably bring ministers in individually, as I said, for the committee stage in the Dáil, so that they can deal with their sections and take questions and potential amendments and so on. And if for whatever reason they can't be there, we can make sure that they can provide briefings separately, and I'll take the legislation for them. But I expect that the ministers will be there. The Enterprise Ireland issues, yeah, I think I said it at the start. Enterprise Ireland want these powers anyway. They're in a larger bit of piece of legislation, and we've essentially plucked out this element of an industrial and commercial bill and to put it in this omnibus piece of legislation because we want it done quickly so that Enterprise Ireland have the maximum flexibility in terms of offering loans and support to businesses in the context of certainly some of the sectors that would be under a lot of strain if there was a no-deal Brexit. It is true to say that's the only piece of legislation that we'd be introducing anyway, but we wouldn't be introducing it by the end of March. It would probably be a year or so away. The insurance green card issue, yeah, we can't legislate for that because that's an EU competence. So, just to kind of read the note on that for you, just so to put it on the record. I mean, currently, all Irish motor vehicles travelling within the EU are covered by the terms of the EU's Motor Insurance Directive. This allows motor vehicles to travel freely between Ireland, Northern Ireland and Britain, as well as obviously across other EU countries. Should a no-deal Brexit occur, the UK, including Northern Ireland, will no longer be party to the Motor Insurance Directive. The Motor Insurance Bureau of Ireland has published advice for policyholders on when and how to get a green card if needed in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Green cards provide proof of insurance and are part of an older system that predates the EU. Citizens driving their Irish registered vehicles in Northern Ireland or any other part of the UK will be required to carry a green card to prove that they have motor insurance. So it's not like they're going to be stopped for it, but if they are stopped, this is a proof of insurance that'll be accepted across the board.
Sorry if I can.
Let me just finish it. The green card system does not affect motorists' cover. Where motorists are currently covered to drive in the UK, they'll remain so under their own policy. So,
my understanding is that Minister Ross has said that Britain and Ireland could reach a bilateral agreement on that issue. Now, I don't know whether that's right, but that's what he has said.
Well, I'd have to see now the context in which he said that, but my understanding is that this is an EU competence, it's an EU directive. Ireland can't essentially...
And could that note be sent on?
Go and do it? Yeah, it can, yeah. So I don't think we can do our own thing on that. We have spoken to the Commission about this because, of course, the EU could do or could put in place a reciprocal arrangement with the UK, like it's done on a temporary basis for hauliers, for example, in the event of a no-deal Brexit. But at the moment, from a contingency point of view, I think the insurance industry are doing the right thing here, just in case, to make sure that people can continue to drive. I mean, don't forget there's hundreds of thousands of crossings of the border every day. The other issues, the cost of the bill. Look, Brexit is costing us hundreds of millions. Like, let's be honest about it, as a country, in terms of working capital facilities, loan facilities, upgrading of Dublin Port, Russell Airport, supports, incentives. This is not without a cost in terms of time, money, and political distraction, if you like. We'd be doing a lot of other things if I didn't have to fill virtually half of my day every day on Brexit issues. But look, this is the reality. This isn't an Irish policy. It's not something we like or support. It's something that our neighbours have chosen to do. We have to respect that. We do have to respect that, and I'm very strong on that. Of course, any country has the right to leave the European Union if it wants. But I'd like to think that we have the kind of relationship with the United Kingdom that they will follow through on the commitments that they've made to us in terms of the context of their decisions. On state aid rules, I'll come back to you now. On state aid rules, we have spoken to the Commission about the relaxation of state aid rules if necessary. We've also spoken to the Commission about protecting vulnerable sectors, particularly agriculture and fishing, through a combination of a relaxation of state aid rules, but also EU supports too. And I think we're very fortunate that we happen to have an Irish Commissioner in the agricultural brief in the Commission, not because he's in any way biased towards Ireland, but he certainly understands the Irish agricultural industry and how vulnerable it is in the context of a no-deal Brexit, should, for example, we have to trade with the UK on WTO terms, including tariffs and so on. The impact that would have on the beef and dairy sectors would be very significant, and we would need to respond to that. And the EU, I believe, will respond to that with the appropriate solidarity.
Just a very quick supplementary, if I can, Carl. I'll just be very, very quick. I do want to acknowledge the response in relation to the easing of state aid rules and supports for the agri-food business from Europe. I think that would be very useful. But just in relation to the costing, of course Brexit is costing us, but to be fair, Cathaoirleach, look, if the opposition brought forward a bill, the first thing would be asked is, how much is this going to cost? So we're going to be asked to support this bill. So I think it's a fair and a reasonable question to ask, how much is this going to cost and where is the money going to come from? Because, OK, we can deal with it at a second stage, but if it could be dealt with today, if you have the figure, I think that would be useful.
Yeah, no, well, sorry, my comments were, well, first of all, nobody can give a figure today as to what Brexit is going to cost. We simply don't know. This bill is about the maintenance of the status quo, actually, primarily. In terms of being able to continue to give grants to students, in terms of being able to facilitate travel, healthcare, and so on. So actually, the absence of this legislation would involve an increased cost too, if we couldn't use Oireachtas Hospital, for example. So that works both ways. But a lot will depend on what Enterprise Ireland do, the amount of money that they have available to them. But I mean, we can come up with an estimate. But actually, most of the elements of this legislation don't have a significant financial cost attached to them. They're about protecting in law what has until now been facilitated by joint EU membership. But there are other areas, of course, that could be very expensive in terms of support packages for vulnerable sectors. And of course, that's why we are lucky we have set aside a rainy day fund, which is a significant fund that if we had to use in an emergency, we could. And that's why we're not going to need a supplementary budget, I'm glad to say. No, with respect, I don't think this was Sinn Féin thinking. But
the next Senator Gabrielle McFadden, Deputy Bernard Durkin, and Deputy Sean Haughey.
Sorry, I didn't answer Neil's questions. My apologies,
Senator.
I noted just in terms of the 19 legislative proposals coming from the Commission. Most of those either take direct effect or we are catering for in the statutory instruments that we're introducing. So there's no delay issue here for them. Most of those are effectively changing EU law or making an exception on a temporary basis to EU law to facilitate, because most of the solutions in terms of contingency coming from the Commission are only temporary solutions until the end of the year, in most cases. So anybody who thinks, by the way, that a no-deal Brexit can hold on to the kind of contingency measures that are being introduced by the EU on a temporary basis, can hold on to them forever. This idea of a sort of a managed no-deal Brexit, that's just a fantasy that doesn't exist. There would be a temporary set of contingencies in place that would facilitate basic movement and so on. But there would be a need for a negotiation for a more permanent arrangement. And in a no-deal Brexit scenario, I think that negotiation would be very difficult.
Thanks, Tánaiste Chip. Senator McFadden.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach. Thank you, Minister, for having the time to be here. And I suppose, first of all, I'd like to commend the work that you have done and the work that the Taoiseach and Minister McEntee and indeed all of the officials that has been done thus far. And I think, it's very, it's great that work was done right from the beginning. Since the referendum, you guys set to work to have us as ready as we possibly can for something that is so unknown. And you have said yourself that the potential impact of a no-deal Brexit would be very severe. So the legislation is welcome to protect, as you say, workers and students, a lot of the Irish students, and to continue the health cooperation across the border. A logistical or a practical thing that worries me is, should there be, and I hope there isn't, the scenario on the 29th of March that we all dread. Practically, what happens the following morning or at midnight on the 29th to the protection of workers or the students that are there? If this all goes through, which I hope it does, the bill, will that continue without any, flawlessly, if you like? That's my question, and I welcome and agree that the bill shall be brought through a committee of the House, and I welcome the fact that all members of the Oireachtas will get a chance to have their say on it, so that it is a whole of government and a whole of an Oireachtas approach. And I just would like to say that you will have, as much as I can say as Whip, the support of the Seanad with that regard. But if you could just give me an idea of the practicalities, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. Deputy Bernard Durkin.
Thank you, Chairman, and I thank the Tánaiste for coming before this joint meeting. I'm a member of the other committee, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad to have an opportunity to be here. Just a couple of things. I think that I agree with the strategy. I believe strongly that it would be inappropriate to bring the contingency legislation forward too soon in this country, because it could be the very thing, its existence at too early a stage could undermine any bargaining position and any examination of alternatives, and would facilitate a concentration on the no deal all out ultimate thing that we're trying to avoid. So I think the strategy has been correct. I think it has been hugely important, and I think, I'm sure to you, Tánaiste, the importance of the unity of all parties on the island of Ireland in relation to the response to the proposal. I think there's a simple reason for that. I think it's a good reason, not alone for unity purposes, but also stemming from the fact that there was no alternative. On the island of Ireland, for the business sector, the political fraternity, and for everybody engaged in trade, the options were very, very limited. And the only option that we could in any way continue as best we could after the separation of our next door neighbour from the European Union would be on the basis maintained by you and the government and by the opposition parties here, for which I think we should be very grateful. I think we should be equally grateful for the unity illustrated by our European colleagues, and particularly the negotiators, without whose single-mindedness of purpose the whole issue would have collapsed a long time ago. And I think they are all to be congratulated for the way that they have understood the Irish situation, for the way that they have maintained their position, and for the way that they have kept the European Union in mind, all its ideals and objectives from start to finish. And I think that that's hugely important, and I hope that that will continue. Two questions, Mr. Chairman. First of all, the common travel area. It is envisaged that the common travel area can be made work after Brexit, after a crash out, or whatever the case may be. And are there any comparisons that can be made with the excise union, the common, on the island of Ireland, with the view to extending the latitude identified in the common travel area? That's one question. And the other question is in relation, Mr. Chairman, to the degree, given the massive interdependability of both parts of the island of Ireland, north and south, the business sector, the commercial sector, the export and import sectors, is it envisaged that dialogue and contact can be maintained with our colleagues in Northern Ireland for right throughout the next, for instance, 6 months or more, or whatever length of time it takes? Can a means be found to have a consultation and a dialogue with the political representatives and the business representatives in Northern Ireland, given the fact that we share the island and that we have common concerns and that we have a common position, and particularly that in Northern Ireland there wasn't a majority voting in favour of leave? That's it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Deputy Durkin. Deputy Seán Haughey.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I thank the Taoiseach for his briefing on this bill, and also to acknowledge the work of our diplomats in Europe who, as the Taoiseach said, has put a huge amount of work and effort into this matter over the last few years, indeed, at this stage. Just to take up the point that Deputy Cullinan made in relation to the EU Motor Insurance Directive, I think it will come as a surprise to many motorists that obligations will be placed on them in the event of a no-deal Brexit, motorists in the UK and motorists coming here. So I think the government probably would need to be very proactive on that with the insurance industry, to put a bit of pressure on the insurance industry, if needed, to alert motorists to their obligations, maybe that the insurance companies would directly contact their clients to make them aware of their obligations in the event of a no-deal Brexit. So I think we need to be more proactive in that regard. Just in relation to the legal process, presumably the Oireachtas will pass this legislation, and it may not be needed. So I'm just wondering what happens after that. If it's not needed, presumably there will be commencement orders or whatever. Would you envisage the whole bill being commenced or whatever? Just how that will work in practicality in the event of a no-deal Brexit. If the legislation, in the event that the legislation is not required. Obviously, that's one thing, but is it involved that there will be commencement orders? You mentioned there that about the budgetary implications. We have been told that there's no need for a supplementary budget this year. You mentioned there about the rainy day fund. So, I mean, a no-deal Brexit is going to have devastating consequences for this country. You know, it could impact on our economic growth, our public finances and so forth. So is that a very definite commitment that there will not be a supplementary budget required this year in any event, in the event of Brexit? The solidarity of the EU 27, can you assure us that that's still holding? I know the former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern at one stage made reference to the fact that, you know, that when it comes to the 11th hour, you know, and the wheeling and dealing and the smoke-filled rooms, I presume there's still smoke-filled rooms in Europe. You know, can you assure us that the solidarity is holding and that we're not coming under any pressure to modify our position? I know there was comments by the Polish Foreign Minister, which I think maybe didn't represent the views, obviously, of the EU 27, but I'd like some assurances in that regard as well. So I think that's about it. Just in relation to the horse industry and the bloodstock industry, I know you've taken an interest in that industry when you were Minister for Agriculture in particular. There's nothing in your contribution today about that. Is there a lot of work needed in that regard? You know, the implications for that industry of a no-deal Brexit, and maybe if you could enlighten us on what needs to be done in that particular area as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deputy Haughey. Thomas, Chair.
Yeah, first of all, I think Gab's questions. What happens on the 29th of March? Well, you know, we will have done everything we can by the 29th of March, and we'll have legislation that will be enacted in time, so that at 11 p.m. on the 29th of March, which is currently the time and date for when Britain formally leaves the European Union, then all of this law will take effect. But that means that students will be able to continue as they did previously. It may mean that cars travelling back and forth across the border will have to have a green card up on the windscreen. But I mean, by and large, the CTA will continue as it does today. By the way, that doesn't solve the problem for lots of people in Ireland who don't have Irish passports or British passports. You know, the Irish economy now has 200 different nationalities. And while they will be able to continue to move between Britain and Ireland because there will be no barriers because of the CTA, they may not be able to work the way they do at the moment, or, you know, they won't have the benefits of this legislation that applies to Irish nationals. So it does change it changes the relationship and does cause issues. But I mean, the real impact will be on sectors like agriculture. You know, we're selling about €2 billion worth of beef into the UK. Which I don't believe will happen, but if it were to happen, that Britain were to leave without a deal and decided to implement full WTO trading arrangements, which some people are openly advocating for in the British Parliament, that means you're talking about tariffs of up to 65% on beef. I think it's about 43% on dairy products. So you're, you know, dramatically changing the commerce and trading environment for hugely important sectors in Ireland. And by the way, in the UK too, you know, like we buy about €3.5 billion worth of food and drink from the UK as well. So, you know, it'll apply both ways. And of course, all of the complexities in relation to the relationships north and south on the island as well, figuring out solutions to that in a short period of time, again, I think will pose pressures, and it'll be difficult. There's no getting away from that. So we are preparing as best we can. As I said, the EU is putting practical contingency plans in place, but it is going to put Ireland under a lot of strain, and in my view put the UK under enormous strain as well. And it'll cost jobs, and it'll damage the economy. I think we have a lot of contingency plans in place to mitigate against that damage, but it'll be difficult. Bernard, yeah, we're very strong EU unity. Others asked that question as well. I think that'll stay. I mean, the EU wants a deal. They want to manage Brexit. They are watching just in astonishment in terms of how the debates progress in Westminster, but it is what it is, and we have to accept that. And as I said, we have to be respectful of that, even though it's frustrating. But I don't believe the EU is in any mood to sacrifice Irish interests to get a deal. We're a member state that's staying, is committed to the EU, and the solidarity with Ireland on this issue, I've never experienced anything like it, quite frankly, in my political life. And I've been in the European Parliament, I've been in multiple different ministries and in different positions in terms of the EU. It's really quite extraordinary, the solidarity that we've got from countries a long, long way away from us geographically, and I think it'll hold. In terms of the CTA, can we extend the latitude of it effectively to include trade? No, we can't, because trade is an EU competence. We're part of an EU single market and customs union. The border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is an EU border as well as a border between the UK and Ireland. So we need solutions that involve the British government and the EU as well. In terms of consultation with all political parties and businesses, north and south, well, we have an all-Ireland Civic Forum again tomorrow in Dublin Castle. It brings everybody together. Everyone's invited. Some people won't be there, but that's their choice. But I'm a regular visitor to Northern Ireland. In fact, I'll be going up tomorrow to Belfast after the civic dialogue. Questions that Deputy Haughey asked, need for more proactivity on the green card. Yeah, I mean, actually the insurance sector has been quite proactive on this in terms of letting their clients and customers know. But we may well have to shift gear in terms of communications if it really looks like this will happen in terms of areas like this. But I also suspect there would be some recognition that it would take a few weeks to adapt to the new realities and so on. But I take the point on communication. On the commencement orders for this legislation, it's section by section. So I'm sure Alma will correct me if I'm wrong here, but if there is a deal and there's no need to enact the majority of this legislation, and if we move into a formal transition period consistent with the withdrawal agreement, I think it's only the last section.
Section 13. Section
13 that would be enacted, because what that does essentially is effectively redefines in law the term member state to apply to the UK outside of the EU but in a transition period with us, just in terms of how that applies to Irish law. So in other words, the status quo is maintained through transition in all the different areas that EU law applies to. But the rest of it wouldn't be necessary. But yeah, so we can commence section by section. Will there be a supplementary budget? Well, I'm told not. I mean, I've spoken to Minister Donoghue and the Taoiseach about this. I mean, if you think about the timing of this, you know, if the UK were to crash out with a deal at the end of March, you're then into April, May, which is really about implementation of contingency, supporting vulnerable sectors and so on, but you're quite quickly into the summer. We're going to have another budget in October. So, you know, I don't think there's a likelihood at all that we'd have a supplementary budget before the summer. And, you know, we're fortunate. I mean, Ireland is back into surplus. It means we'd have to borrow more money, I think. And it means that the outlook in terms of economic growth changes. So certainly the budget arithmetic changes. But I don't think we will need to introduce an emergency budget or anything like that. The horse racing industry, as you know, this week I was speaking to the horse racing industry. one of a number of sectors that are very vulnerable. I mean, even if you look at the all-island approach to horse racing, there are 7,000 thoroughbreds across the border each year for breeding purposes, back to places like Downroyal for race meets and so on. It's an industry worth, I think, 1.85 billion euros to the Irish economy each year, and has an interest in virtually every county in the country. So, and that relies on this seamless relationship between Britain and Ireland and the UK and Ireland. So, Brexit interrupts that, particularly in relation to East-West, in terms of veterinary certs, in terms of managing of disease, and we've had an example of that even in the last week around equine flu in the UK, which I think has been managed well, and has been managed well in Ireland to keep it out. Yeah, there is uncertainty for the horse racing industry, like there is for other sectors. The only thing about the horse industry is that they don't face the kind of tariffs that the beef and dairy sectors would have to face. It's nothing like that. I think if you're selling a horse, I think the tariff's about 11%, which is still significant, but not nothing like the kind of dramatic tariff impact that would happen for either dairy or beef.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. Taoiseach, I want to thank you for your detailed presentation here this evening. And indeed, as Senator Neil Richmond said, we got a very good briefing from you yesterday at the meeting of committee chairs. And I was very glad in quick perusal of the draft bill to welcome the fact that many of the issues that affect constituents of mine on a daily basis in regard to people accessing pensions, being paid pensions here, people who have formerly worked in Britain or came from Britain, people travelling across the border, either north or south north, for employment purposes or to access education or health services, that from a quick reading of the bill, it protects those people going about their daily business, and we welcome that. Taoiseach, you mentioned that there's a willingness at EU level to relax EU state aid rules, and hopefully for the agriculture sector, for the agri-food sector, that we would see market support measures activated to help deal with the difficulties facing the beef sector at the present time, and indeed if there is severe market disturbance, that additional measures would be implemented and activated to help that particular sector. Deputy Cullinan referred to the cost. Well, I don't think you could quantify the cost in any way, because I know myself from my own immediate area and from the border region in general, the uncertainty has set in and damaged business and commerce. I know some enterprises that were planning to expand, they put those on hold. There's uncertainty. There's a great hesitancy to invest or expand. And Deputy Durkin used the word interdependability earlier. As you know, as all of us know here, there's a huge interdependence in the agri-food sector and construction products sector, engineering sector, in the economies both north and south. The Brexit referendum result has impacted negatively on all of those sectors so far. Earlier today at the Good Friday Committee, and I welcome the fact that members from ICBAN and from the East Border region have joined us in the public gallery here this evening, they outlined, and they're representative of public representatives at local authority level right across the border area, north and south. They were with us at the Good Friday Committee outlining the difficulties that area faces at the present time, the need for additional investment. They put across a very good case of the very large scale and widespread cooperation that has existed, particularly since 1998, and we don't want to see that damaged, and we want to see that continue. And I compliment those people at local authority level, supported by their officials, the very good positive work that has been done to support the Good Friday Agreement as well. Could I also say that in my own constituency, when I travel through it, I travel into Fermanagh regularly, going from parts of Cavan, parts of Monaghan, and internally in County Monaghan as well. Over the past few months, past few weeks in particular, quite a number of British citizens who have been living a long time in our own state have been concerned about their pension entitlements and their rights here. And I'm glad that that will be underpinned by legislation to ensure that those people will continue to have their entitlements. It's very important in that respect. And could I also say, as all the party spokespersons have said, everybody here will be very supportive of the legislation, and as a committee I want to assure you of our cooperation in whatever legislative role we have, or legislative, whatever pieces of legislation will need to go through this particular committee. So again, Tánaiste, I want to thank you for your detailed presentation and your good engagement with all the members here this evening. The meeting will now go into private session, so members and only. Thank you, Tánaiste.